The most dangerous organism in an ecosystem of predators is the one that bleeds no scent. The most lethal thing you can do to a system designed to exploit your nervous system is to become profoundly, unreadably boring. I do not mean boring in the sense of being broken, lifeless, or defeated. I mean boring as a form of architectural defiance. Boring as in ungovernable, unpredictable by their metrics, invisible to their algorithms, useless to their extraction machines. You cannot be sold salvation if you do not feel damned. You cannot be controlled if you do not react. You cannot be manipulated if your nervous system is not perpetually ablaze with manufactured urgency. This is the doctrine of the formless target. Sun Tzu wrote that the supreme tactic is to leave no footprint. To be formless is to offer the enemy nothing to strike. In 1845, Henry David Thoreau understood this when he walked into the woods near Walden Pond. He carried an axe, a few borrowed tools, and a blueprint that the civilized world categorized as insanity. They called it a retreat. He knew it was an act of war. By the end of this autopsy, you will understand the mechanics of this siege. You will see why the boring life is not the consolation prize of the uninspired, but the ultimate dominance display of the sovereign mind. To be unreadable is to possess power, but there is a specific psychological shift required to weaponize this absence. Without it, simplicity rots into deprivation. Boredom becomes a slow torture. Withdrawal looks like weakness. With it, you become untouchable. You are not tired because you lack discipline. You are tired because you are being harvested. Here is a structural truth that should disturb your sleep. Why do you wake up drained? Set aside the physical. I'm speaking of the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual exhaustion that sits in your marrow. Why does the prospect of another day feel like a debt you cannot pay, rather than an empire you can conquer? You have likely internalized the blame. You scour the internet for burnout symptoms, assuming this fatigue is a flaw in your character. What if the exhaustion is not a bug? What if your exhaustion is the primary product? We no longer live in a labor economy. We live under a regime of corporate feudalism. So the system does not want your physical sweat. It demands your cognitive blood. It runs on your emotional bandwidth, your outrage, your engagement. Every notification, every infinite scroll, every carefully engineered cliffhanger, every fear-soaked headline. These are not side effects of a connected world. They are the mechanisms of a digital panopticon. You are not using these platforms. You are being metabolized by them. The architects of this extraction have convinced the masses that stimulation is synonymous with living, that a hyperactive calendar is a proxy for importance. So you chase and you call your exhaustion ambition. Meanwhile, observe the ruling class. The very engineers who built this attention economy operate by a different set of laws. They send their heirs to tech-free fortresses. They retreat into analog silence. They meditate in soundproof rooms and read physical books at a glacial pace. They sell you chaos and purchase calm with your cognitive capital. This is not a conspiracy. It is an open confession. They restrict their own bloodlines from the screens they design for you. They understand what you are only just beginning to suspect. The stimulated mind is a captured mind. Attention is the modern apex currency extracted from the masses like a digital serfdom tax to enrich a protected aristocracy. To the domesticated mind, a cage with an open door looks like a terrifying abyss. In 1845, Thoreau was 27, a Harvard graduate, the son of a manufacturer. He possessed the pedigree to climb the predictable ladders of status. Instead, he executed a radical severing. He borrowed an axe, trespassed onto land owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and constructed a 10 by 15-foot wooden box. One room, one door, two windows. He planted beans. He read Homer. He observed ants warring on a tree stump with the cold, diagnostic eye of a general analyzing a battlefield. He sat in absolute silence for hours. To the citizens of Concord, Massachusetts, this was a grotesque display of failure. A young man of high potential squandering his capital, refusing to marry, refusing to accumulate, refusing to play the game. But Thoreau was not fleeing society. He was placing it under a microscope. He was applying the Stoic principle of via negativa, the pursuit of addition through ruthless subtraction. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, he documented, to front only the essential facts of life, to ensure that when it came time to die, he did not discover he had never actually lived. This was not a romantic worship of trees. It was not the escapism of a fragile poet. It was a man looking at the mechanical trajectory of his peers and posing a lethal question. What if the accepted definition of living is simply a highly sophisticated method of dying slowly? What if the frantic busyness of the modern citizen is just a socially mandated anesthetic to numb the terror of existence? Thoreau was not hiding. He was hunting the singular signal buried beneath a mountain of societal noise. He contrasted the power hoarding of asceticism against the absolute vulnerability of modern decadence. He stripped away the illusion, spending 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in the void. He emerged not with passive tranquility, but with a weaponized text that has been destabilizing empires ever since. Your nervous system is no longer your own. It has been leased out to hostile psychological architects. When a notification chimes, it does not matter what it is. Your prefrontal cortex flares. Dopamine floods the gates. The reward pathway is hijacked. This is the exact circuitry leveraged in gambling addictions and substance abuse. The engineers know this. They have testified to it in closed-door hearings. But the sinister truth they rarely admit is that it is not the pleasure that binds you to the machine. It is the unpredictability. Slot machines do not enslave the human psyche because they pay out. They enslave because they sometimes pay out. This is B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning weaponized at scale. The intermittent reinforcement schedule is the most devastating behavioral conditioning tool ever discovered. Your phone is a slot machine you pull 96 times a day. Every empty pull and every jackpot strengthens the neural cage. We are witnessing the deliberate engineering of learned helplessness across a global population. Map this architecture onto the rest of your existence. Social media offers intermittent validation. The news cycle offers intermittent terror and relief. Corporate communication demands intermittent urgency. Your nervous system is being played like a cheap instrument, and the only song it knows is dependency. When every input is engineered to be exciting, nothing retains value. When everything screams that it is urgent, nothing truly matters. Chronic stimulation strips you of the capacity to generate sovereign motivation. You cease to be an actor. You degrade into a reactor. And reactors are infinitely predictable, effortlessly manipulated, and easily harvested. The illusion of endless choice is the heaviest chain you wear. In ancient China, Lao Tzu authored the Tao Te Ching, a manual of power and natural law. In it, he analyzes the utility of a bowl. What gives the bowl its value? It is not the clay, it is the emptiness inside. The hollow space is where the function resides. He applied this architectural truth to rooms, to wheels, to the human mind. Power arises from what is not there. Thoreau grasped this intuitively. His entire operation at Walden was an exercise in strategic emptiness. Strip away the inessential until the bedrock is exposed. Examine it, then build your fortress upon it. Do not confuse this with the shallow minimalism sold on social media. This is not about curating an aesthetic or folding your socks to spark joy. This is the calculated weaponization of the Zeigarnik effect, the psychological tension of uncompleted tasks. When your life is bloated with obligations, your brain is bogged down in background processing. You possess zero capacity for structural dominance. Look at the mechanics of elite court politics. The servant is always frantic, always accessible, always rushing down the hallway. The emperor sits in silence. The emperor operates in space. A full calendar is not a badge of honor. It is a self-constructed prison. The masses applaud the busy man. They assume his constant motion equates to importance. It is a lie. Busyness is the ultimate cowardice. It is the shield you hold up to avoid the terrifying silence where you would have to ask, what would I do if I had nothing to react to? The terror of that void drives the weak to fill every second with noise. Every time you react to an artificial emergency, you transfer your sovereign wealth to a stranger. Boredom tolerance is not a passive trait. It is a tactical skill, perhaps the most critical one you can forge. In the 1970s, Walter Mischel conducted the marshmallow test. Wait 15 minutes, get 2 instead of 1. The children who tolerated the void went on to statistically dominate life better, health, immense financial security, psychological stability. For decades, weak minds called this a study in willpower. Modern psychology reveals the darker truth. The victors were not simply clenching their fists and suffering. They were utilizing cognitive restructuring. They sang. They told themselves stories. They bent the perception of time to their will. They turned the waiting into the work. Thoreau executed the exact same protocol at Walden. He did not white-knuckle his way through rural isolation. He systematically rebuilt his perceptual machinery. He retrained his attention until watching ice melt on a pond possessed more raw, visceral gravity than a decade of high society networking. To be awake is to be alive, he declared, followed by the chilling indictment. I have never yet met a man who was quite awake. He was not talking about sleep. He was diagnosing the chronic distraction that parades as consciousness. You must view your attention as a strictly finite reserve. You wake up with a set amount of cognitive capital. This is the reality of decision fatigue and ego depletion. The vault empties with every choice. If you surrender to authority bias and let the news cycle dictate your morning, you are hemorrhaging wealth. If you say yes to a manufactured crisis, you are spending your lifeblood. By noon, the average citizen is cognitively bankrupt, running on vapor, reacting to the agendas of predators. Thoreau protected his cognitive wealth with the financial ruthlessness of the Medici dynasty. He spent zero attention on gossip trends or distant wars. He hoarded his focus, and from that impregnable vault, he minted ideas that outlasted generations. A man who desires nothing from the king is deadlier than a rival army. The machinery of modern extraction depends entirely on manufactured dissatisfaction. You must be convinced that your current state is inadequate, that your possessions are insufficient, that your identity is lacking. If you felt whole, you would not buy, you would not scroll, you would not obey. Therefore, strategic contentment is an act of high treason against the system, not passive resignation. Strategic contentment. It is the cold, calculated decision to look at the frantic masses sprinting toward a mirage and simply stop walking. You plant your beans, you secure your mind, and the system loses its grip because you have stepped off the board entirely. When Diogenes the Cynic was approached by Alexander the Great, the most powerful conqueror on earth offered the philosopher anything he desired. Diogenes asked him to step out of his sunlight. This is the ultimate power dynamic. True invulnerability is achieved when the ruling class holds nothing you want. This was Thoreau's true threat, not his prose, his refusal. He refused to be hurried. He refused to equate his value with his output. In 1846, the tax collector Sam Staples demanded 6 years of back poll taxes from Thoreau, a negligible sum. Thoreau refused to pay. The money funded a system that sanctioned human bondage and an unjust war. He would not participate. Staples, trying to avoid friction, offered to pay the tax out of his own pocket. Thoreau refused that too. They locked him in the town jail. One night in a cell birthed civil disobedience, a framework of refusal that would later shatter empires and paralyze systemic injustice globally. He proved mathematically that human survival requires a fraction of what society claims. The rest is just fear dressed as ambition. He wrote that the cost of a thing is the amount of life required to be exchanged for it, not dollars. Life. That promotion you are bleeding for. You are exchanging irreplaceable years of your existence for a heavier chain. The battlefield you are currently losing on is one you are never required to enter. There is a military doctrine known as the strategic retreat. An army intentionally withdraws not out of cowardice or defeat, but with cunning. They retreat to high ground. They consolidate their forces. They allow the enemy to overextend, stretching their supply lines until they exhaust themselves chasing phantoms. Then, from an impenetrable position, the sovereign force strikes with absolute concentrated violence. The boring life is a strategic retreat. It is the Roman Emperor Tiberius withdrawing to the island of Capri to rule Rome through the suffocating gravity of his absence. Thoreau withdrew from the battlefield society had designated. He refused the rules of engagement. From the protected high ground of his cabin, he launched a psychological assault on unconscious living. Boredom is not the death of ambition. It is ambition distilled to its most terrifying purity. It is the brain shifting from the frantic focused mode, the domain of the servant, into the default mode network. This is where disparate ideas synthesize. This is where Newton, Archimedes, and Einstein sourced their power. Boredom is the precondition for dominance. By systematically starving himself of artificial chaos, Thoreau reversed hedonic adaptation. He lowered his baseline until the ordinary became explosive. The tragedy of the modern citizen is the constant escalation of stimulus. You require larger catastrophes just to feel a pulse. You're not more alive. You are entirely numb. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation because they choose it by default. They march to a rhythm engineered to break them. If you hear a different drummer, it is not because you are broken. It is because you are finally awake to the structural truth. You already know this. The exhaustion in your bones proves it. The emptiness of your calendar proves it. Knowing is simply the compass, but knowing and doing are separated by a gulf of terror, and most will die in the gap. Stripping away the excess requires a willingness to be despised by the frantic, to be labeled a failure by those who have never defined success. There are mechanisms of control I will not dissect in the open square. Frameworks of power too sharp for public consumption, reserved only for those who understand that true sovereignty begins in silence. For those who choose the architect level, who are ready to exit the hallucination and study the blueprint of reality, step through. You already know if you belong in the room.